what he's talking about and can do some great predictions. I think now it's more recapping and maybe longer-term predictions. But with no further ado, I'll hand it off to Kevin.
Hey, thank you very much. Thank you. Entertaining and qualified. My second grade teacher was wrong. I did amount to something. And I'll tell you what, I mean, after 2016's like wrong, hey, Trump can't win. You know, it felt good to finally get one right in 2018. So, and by the way, I know I'm not the only one. So I know a lot of us probably woke up surprised and quite hungover the next day. But anyway, I want to thank EBRI and everybody else for having me here. It's a delight to be with you. These are somewhat cathartic for me as well to go through and try to think strategically. How do we help not only the folks that I work with, but like folks like yourselves sort of manage their way through this environment. And the presentation I'm about to give is a little bit like a weather report, just to kind of more of a clinical assessment of the environment out there and what you all I think need to know as you look at how your business and the work that you do can navigate it. So you know, I spent a long time actually looking for. I was like, you know, I need a depiction of exactly what the political environment is, and I kept thinking like chaos, like tornadoes, like earthquakes, that type of thing. So I came up with this, right? And I thought it was like the perfect summary of it. And then I turned on the television and watched for 20 minutes an absolute melee in the Oval Office the other day, and I'm like, well, I didn't need that slide. Everybody pretty much saw the acrimony, the chaos that is going to really sort of drive and shape the political environment for at least the next 6 months, if not the next year. So I just want to take a walk through, and please, I hope to make this a dynamic conversation so that if any of you all have questions or thoughts or ideas or inputs that you want to add while I go through the presentation, please do. But I'll make sure that we have a robust Q&A discussion here at the end. So, so the first thing is, what were some of the takeaways from the 28 midterms? And 4 things I thought were pretty clear. First was they were all about Trump, and midterms typically are. It's usually a referendum on the performance of the White House, and the performance of the party in power usually tracks very closely with the approval rating of the president that's in office. And so historically that tracked pretty closely, but they were all about Trump, and in many ways Trump tried to make it about Trump. The GOP, the suburbs, these areas that are crucial for making and breaking House and Senate majorities, were killing fields if you were a Republican candidate. And one of the interesting things, there was a lot of surprises on Election Day, but the blue wave washed up on some very red shores around the country. Places Democrats won in places where we hadn't seen them win before, or at least in a long time. And then what happened to the Republican Party and some of the lessons learned? Well, they got a little Trumpier. A lot of them woke up the next day and looked around, and there are a lot of Trump allies left and a lot of Trump critics no longer in office. So let me talk a little bit about each one of those points in a little bit more depth. The first is the Trump factor. He loomed very large on the minds of people who were going to the polls. And not in a good way, because if you look at some of these numbers, there aren't many people out there who don't have, and I'm sure this tracks very closely with as you make your rounds during the holiday circuit, or you're standing on a sideline like I am at some of my kids' games. There aren't many shortages of opinions when it comes to President Trump. They either love him or they hate him, and they're not afraid to talk about it. And so one of the interesting things here is just how strongly people approve of him, and how strongly people disapprove of him, and how much that was a factor in driving a lot of the Democrat enthusiasm that we saw on November 6th. And only 1 out of 3 voters said that he was not a factor. So this was very much a referendum on where you stood on supporting the president. 26% of those that were voting in the House elections, we didn't get some data for Senate because we couldn't really do a lot of the exit polls didn't really break it down that way, but if you look at this national number, 26% of those voting in House elections said their vote was a vote to support Trump, but the people who wanted to come out and vote and register a vote against Trump, and that was the lens that they saw their local contest between 2 people running for Congress, 38%. So the folks that were out there were more animated about sending a message about their resistance to the Trump presidency. Here are these huge losses in Republican servers, and this is what, when I worked for Tom DeLay, when he was majority leader, he used to say, Kevin, we'll govern the majority through the moderates, and the moderates live in the suburbs. And if you look in the suburbs, the GOP got smoked, and we're seeing some of these numbers may be hard for you all to see, but we're seeing increases of plus 13% in Democrat turnout in Montgomery County, some of these collar counties around Philadelphia, the collar counties around in the suburbs of New York. Think of Columbus, Ohio, Atlanta, Georgia, Washington, D.C., these suburbs out here in Loudoun County, out in Virginia. We saw a huge uptick in support for Democrat candidates. And this is where you win or lose House majorities. And it wasn't just in some of these areas here, but you go even further. Orange County, which used to have a number of Republican congressmen, Congress representatives out there, they all lost. And then places like Houston, Texas, the suburbs of Dallas, Texas, places where you traditionally feel that the overwhelming red nature of the state will help help Republican candidates down ticket. It didn't. The number of people that were coming out to register a vote against Democrats, suburban women with college degrees who were resistant to Trump, played a huge factor in this election, and as a result, they got swamped in the suburbs. And then, I mean, you have Democrats winning in places like Oklahoma City, which is kind of one of the birthing grounds for the Tea Party, and then Charleston, South Carolina, where they haven't had a Democrat win down there in a really long time. Like, this is a warning sign for Republicans. And also, with some of the changing demographics in some of these areas, a lot of the folks are being pushed out into these suburbs. And, South Carolina is a lot different than many people think. When you think it's just a southern state, and it's full of evangelicals, but instead there are a lot of big businesses going into places like that, BMW, Boeing, and as a result, you have changing demographics, changing party there, and Republicans were in a difficult position in 2018 as a result. And there's no going back. This is a headline from the New York Times of all places, and it was written by somebody who said this is a good thing, that there's no going back. It's Trump's party right now. And the House Republican Conference woke up the day after Election Day, and all the folks that had survived looked around and said, boy, we all supported Trump. We wanted to build a big wall. We wanted to, double down on all of his policies. We made sure that we made our points about the caravan every single day in the last 2 weeks of the race, and we're still here. The folks who were critics or a little bit more hesitant or tried to keep Trump at arm's length, they all lost. And so the message that is ultimately learned from that by a lot of these folks in the Republican conference is that it's the party of Trump now, and we have to win or lose with him. And so as we look at the 2019 landscape and what was learned, here are some of the things to watch. With the White House, the three things to watch there are going to be the tension, the turnover, and the Twitter. I'll get a little bit more into that. And then the Democrats' dilemma of what they do now that they've power. They've actually, the dog that caught the car, what do they do with it? And then how is it that the Republicans start to piece the party back and try to find their way back into the majority? What does the roadmap for that look like? So, chaos is the new normal. I am so shocked at how many times the question I get from people is like, Kevin, when are things going to go back to normal? When are things going to just calm down and everybody's going to start working in a nice bipartisan way and focus on the issues? And my answer is always never. This is the new normal. We are in this big reality television show called Washington, and our executive producer, Donald Trump, runs a lot of it through his Twitter feed. But what's really important to watch now with this chaos is as we look at today and you just watch the headlines, I mean, I'm always almost scared sometimes when I come out of a meeting that's more than an hour to check my phone. And like you go in and the chyron is, you go into the meeting and things seem fine. You come out and there's a cable news television on somewhere, and the chyron is breaking news, new indictment, new announcement, new this, new that, right? Or new tweet from the president. And the chaos will continue, and it's almost as if they program it on like a 30-minute interval. But the one thing that I think you have to watch is the special counsel report, in addition to the investigations that we see out of the Southern District of New York or the Eastern District of Virginia. There's going to be new developments on that every single day. And that will consume this White House from here all the way through 2020. For anybody who's worked closely with a White House or worked in a White House, you know how distracting that can be to focusing on your political priorities, your policy priorities, and it ultimately when you have to be in sync with your allies on Capitol Hill, it can hurt that relationship as well, and this town can become very dysfunctional. The staff turnover, you guys see the headline, right? We've got like 10 people now and almost kind of like a reality TV apprentice version of who's going to be chief of staff. And it's almost as if like you probably could have named somebody, but we need like the ratings for another 2 weeks to go on. That turnover, already very high, will continue, particularly when a new Democratic Congress may take over and we see a greater degree of oversight, more subpoenas. It's going to be very tough to work in this White House, and I can tell you just anecdotally, there are a lot of folks out there looking for jobs that are working in this administration, and that can have a tough impact on just the daily process of governing, and so that'll be something to watch. And then President Trump is going to rely on who he believes is his best defender and his most effective medium for that, which is himself and his Twitter feed. I always joke that if we really wanted to solve some of these problems, like somebody could invent an iPhone where the president thinks he's tweeting, but he's really not. His approval ratings would probably shoot to about 65%, given the state of where the economy is. But that's not going to happen. So we are going to see this president defend himself very vigorously and very regularly on Twitter. And as we see, it causes news cycles, it causes markets, volatility in the news cycle, volatility in markets, volatility in the political markets as well. So what will the Democrats do? They face some pressures of their own internally. There is a tremendous pressure from the most active part of their liberal base of the Democratic Party to resist this president at all costs. And that does include the two I words, investigations and impeachment. There are strong likelihood that the pressure will build on Democratic leaders to hold this president accountable, to do their job, and to resist this president at all costs, and not work with him to cut deals instead, but to offer a calcified and principled resistance to what they believe are wrong policies of this White House. But Democrat leaders will argue, and you've seen this, this is their message, it's not mine, but they will tell you that you can govern and administer oversight at the same time. You can walk and chew gum. But it will be increasingly difficult to do both, I think, as that pressure from the liberal base that they believe, that liberal base that believes they put this majority into office wants to see. So, but where can there be deals? I think the most likely area is prescription drugs. This is not based on any position I have on that, but more on just intel that you gather from both Republicans and Democrats and folks in the White House about where the art of the deal lies. Prescription drug prices are something where they all think they can claim some kind of credit. We've actually seen HHS already offer some of their plans of their own on that. Infrastructure is one that if you looked at it technically, everybody says they want to get infrastructure done. We all know it's the circulatory system of the American economy. We all hit the same potholes on the way to work every single day. And it is one of those areas where the political incentives I think are more obvious back home as well. But again, it's given all of the focus that there will be on oversight and accountability and potential investigations, we all know that legislation that everybody agrees on is very hard to get done. What happens when you don't have all of those ingredients together? It becomes even harder. So infrastructure is still a pretty tough haul. And then healthcare, and the president this morning was tweeting about how great the USMCA, formerly known as NAFTA, the artist formerly known as NAFTA 2.0, whatever you want to call it, is a priority. He's going about it in a very odd way, but that's one area that the White House would point out as a legislative, where they can make legislative progress. So the Republican revival, what does it look like? One of the things I've always learned from both working on campaigns and working on Capitol Hill is that politicians always tend to take the wrong lessons from losses. And there was a Jonathan Martin piece last week. If you all get a chance to read it, about the party actually internally in conversations inside the House Republican Conference, they feel like what they need to do is double down on the Trump agenda and work more closely with the president on this realignment that they believe is taking place across the country in order for them to win national elections and to win back the House. That's an interesting take, I should say. It's probably a nice way of saying it, given the losses that they've suffered in the suburbs and the losses that they suffered in the House. But in the Senate, you can look to them to probably be a Senate judicial confirmation machine. There are a number of folks in the queue right now that Mitch McConnell is looking. One of his big goals is to remake the federal judiciary, and he's going to concentrate on what he can control, and that is certainly one thing that he can control now that he has the votes. The House, you're going to see them become more communicators, less legislators. They're going to learn, I wouldn't say quickly, they're going to learn the tough way that there's not much that they can do now, and for many of them, never having served a day in a House minority, it's going to be tough for them, and they're going to have a learning experience. But I think gradually what they will learn is that they are now communicators rather than legislators. And that essentially that means that they're the new opposition party. So where do they look? Some of the issues that they look to draw, probably the starkest contrast with a Nancy Pelosi-led Democrat majority. They're going to have to fight hard and link arms with the president on any potential investigations that may potentially lead to impeachment. We're already in the middle of a spending showdown. That went really well the other day, right? We're already in the middle of a spending showdown, and this is one area where the Republican Party is going to have to do a lot of soul searching, because if you looked at the last 2 years, there really wasn't a whole lot of attention paid to rising deficits, an emphasis on paying down the debt or anything like that. So not the strongest, not the best terra firma to argue against Democrats, but it may be one of these areas where they think they can sort of recapture the fiscal conservative mantle and in a way that both energizes their base and maybe gets them some political wins. If Democrats decide to make some changes to the tax reform legislation that passed last year, they're going to offer up the Republicans will be the new opposition party. And the same goes for health care and any changes that happen there. But that brings us to election 2020, and this was one of the things I pointed out during our the last time I had a presentation amongst a group like this. But it was that. Like around 9 p.m. on November 6th, 2018, that the 2020 race would start, and it did. Automatically, you saw Wolf Blitzer turning to his local panel, or the panel of experts that were with him, and saying, "So what does this all mean for 2020? What does this mean for the president's reelection?" And we have, by conservative estimation, about 2,020 candidates running against the president. You have a huge field. And if you look at 2018 as a way to assess and read some of the tea leaves on what the prospects are for a President Trump reelection, there were some mixed signals. And so I'm going to go through a couple of those. So here's your 2020 field. And I don't even have Oprah there. I don't have The Rock. Bloomberg made it in there. Who else are we missing? We're missing some big ones in there, but this was all I could fit onto one page. The handicapping is already underway. It's probably the number one question that I get from many reporters. Who do you think the Democrats are going to put up? And I'm like, of which one of them? I don't know. But and the odds making is already going on too. But you already see stories in the political horse race reporters already writing who's in New Hampshire, who's in Iowa. The staff primary has already started as well. You just hear already of top Democrat operatives in places like New Hampshire and South Carolina and Florida and California and Texas. They're all being snapped up by this campaign, that campaign. And it's a very, very competitive staff primary, given that you have so many people that have already really decided to run and are putting in place the building blocks of their campaign. Think about this, we are only probably 4 to 5 months away from our first televised presidential debate amongst Democratic primary candidates of 2020. And when I was working on Romney's campaign in 2008, it was around April 2007 that we had our first televised debate, and it was out in like the Reagan Library out in California. And the crazy thing about it, it was on MSNBC. Like, can you think about that? Like a Republican primary debate on MSNBC nowadays? No chance, right? Hosted by like Rachel Maddow. So that's, we're only a few months away, so the campaign's already started. And one of the challenges for those in Washington and for Nancy Pelosi and and Chuck Schumer and other congressional Democrats trying to set priorities and advance an agenda is that the circus of a presidential campaign is just so alluring for the media. And what's going to happen is that increasingly the profile of the party and its agenda and its priorities will be shaped by this internecine battle that they're going to be having amongst many of those candidates. And the titular head of the Democratic Party will begin to emerge more on the campaign trail of 2020 than it will here in Washington in 2019. So that tension between congressional Democrats and those that are all running for president is going to be very real. And it'll be interesting to see whether or not they can work to find some common ground, or at least work together so that they're not at odds, but instead they're in sync. So that brings us to Trump's reelection prospects. And I'm surprised how many people actually buy into this idea. Like, he actually is the odds-on favorite right now to win re-election. And even though we're fed this daily breaking news alerts on our phones about indictments and announcements and scandals and tweets and things like that. But that's the average of his current re-election odds. They're at 7.5. And incumbents have a pretty good track record. 5 of the last 7 have won re-election with little really relation to midterm performance. And oftentimes what we've seen, and we saw this with President Obama, after he took what he called a shellacking in 2010, there's a course correction. And it swung back. Even though he took a shellacking in 2010, he won re-election in 2012. So that's the amazing thing about the American public. They can never really make up their mind from every 2 years. The other thing that he's going to have as an advantage is that 2018 was just a referendum on him. And many of these contests were out of the control of some of these candidates and fought through the lens of whether or not you were for or against Trump. That's not going to be the case in 2020. Presidential elections are very unique in that sense, in that they are a choice. And that contrast is what Trump is looking for, and that's why sometimes you see him engage Nancy Pelosi, because he kind of wants to run against the San Francisco liberal, or you see him engage Kamala Harris, or he engages Cory Booker. He wants to have a fight with some of these folks one-on-one rather than have it all be a referendum on just him and his performance. One of the questions that's really important to his prospects will be whether or not he faces a primary. It's possible that he does. John Kasich, who ran in 2012, who ran in the primary in 2016, is spending as much time in New Hampshire as some of the Democratic candidates. So he is weighing a possible Republican primary, and then there's also talk that he might run on a third-party bid. But that would not fare well for President Trump, because if you look at the history of presidents who have faced primaries in their own party, they may win that primary, they always do, but they then are weakened for a general election. And there are warning signs, and here are some of the warning signs for Trump for 2020. He's got this low approval rating, and I think it was something that he was able to navigate. He's never really had a high approval rating. But state by state in an electoral college, he was able to manage his way to an electoral college win because he was just a little bit more popular than Hillary Clinton in some of these states. That helped him. But his low approval rating right now is being matched with low approval ratings in key battleground states like Colorado, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan, that are going to be crucial to the math he needs to win re-election. And that brings me to my last 2 points. So is there an economic downturn on the horizon? I don't know. There's flattening of the yield curves. I look at this data all the time, and it's very interesting. The trade war one of my pieces of advice for candidates, if I had a chance to advise the president early on in 2018, it would have been don't start a trade war in a really in a good economy. But we are, every day, as you see with the roller coaster of the markets, there are reactions to this lack of certainty when it comes to international markets, and it is having it can have a depressive effect on the American economy. And there are a lot of more folks out there arguing for a bear market than a bull market right now. It would be something to watch. And then that winning coalition that he had, and if you think about it, 2016 was really decided by about 10,000 voters in 3 states. And in those 3 states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, that coalition of voters that he won with is starting to fray. And it could potentially hurt him in 2020. Until we find out who the candidate is, that's the case. But with that, I will turn it over for any questions. Yeah. Yes.
So that was really interesting. What's your view on what's just happened in Wisconsin and Michigan in terms of the existing Republicans grabbing power and trying to minimize the impact of the incoming new governor?
Yeah, well, it's not going to help. I mean, it sort of contributes to this overall narrative of sort of Republicans that are really not coming to grips with the fact that they suffered huge losses at their own hands. And those 3 states, Democrats won governorships in all 3. One of them was an open seat, one of them was a takeaway, Wisconsin, and the other one was a hold in Pennsylvania. And those are foreboding signs for Republicans. It's really hard to win the PR war on that, particularly when you see how animated Democrat voters, grassroots voters are in pointing the fingers at the Republican legislature. So it's one of the things that I, as a Republican, though, what does that mean nowadays? That I worry about, because it's like, have we learned the lessons? And that was why my main point was, like, we seem to never really learn the lessons of the last election, or learn the wrong lessons. That's a case study of it. Yes.
I've got 2 questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
The first is, do you think that there is a place for moderate Republicans to come up and create a something else, A? And then B, do you think that the debates and the concerns about Trump and sexism, racism, sort of all of the really, scary stuff that we're seeing will in any way make this a little bit different than what we've seen in the past?
On the first part, it's going to be very hard. One of the things that we discussed right before the election was the amazing ability that Trump has had with solidifying his support within the Republican Party. So while we hear a lot of anecdotes about, like, those inside the party that are resistant to Trump, the never-Trumpers, right? People who are sort of principled opponents of this version of the Republican Party. When you gauge Republican voters overall and you actually do the research, his approval rating is probably close to 85%. So never-Trumpers, you can probably fit them in a phone booth. So this idea that there's going to be a movement against them, led by, like, people always ask me about my old boss, Mitt Romney, now that he's in the Senate. Like, is he going to, like, lead this fight against Trump? And I don't see it, because I don't think the numbers are there to really lead a big fight. There is a civil war going on inside the Republican Party, but moderates are getting crushed. And so there will be efforts. Elise Stefanik in the House is trying to start a group of folks inside the House to help support more women candidates, more moderate candidates that can win in places like the Northeast. But it's going to be a very, very difficult uphill challenge. If the idea of third party, too, I don't know if that was one of the things you were alluding to, but I'll answer it anyway. Paul Begala gave me the best advice years ago. He said, third parties are like bees. They sting and then they die. And they do. They kind of like, they're like cicadas. They kind of come out and make noise, and then they go away, and they come back in 17 years, right? So, so I just don't see it. What was the second part of it? Yeah, well, I don't know how to answer those. Those are too meta of a question for me to answer, racism, sexism. I can't solve it here in the 5-minute answer. But I will say those charges right now are dragging down the Republican Party. And if you look at the demographics, how we did with suburban women, how we did with younger women, unmarried women, African Americans, Latinos, like, this is a changing country, and we're going in the wrong direction on those demographics. So it's problematic. It has to be dealt with. We did an audit of the Republican Party's efforts on this, and after 2012, and one of the lessons was we need to do a better job of broadening our appeal to a changing demographics of a changing country, and then we elected Trump. It's like, okay, I guess nobody read it. This is kind of like my calculus class in college, and nobody did the work, but
Yes, can you be a little more specific on the prescription drug, what we might see? Is there something with the pharmacy benefit managers there, do you think, or?
I don't know, other than when you talk to the most liberal Democrat from California and you talk to the most conservative Republican from like Erie, PA, and you ask them, what can you guys agree on? They say, prescription drug crisis, opioid epidemic. Like, those are the things that they all cite. And so I don't know what the legislation will look like. I don't know what the political coalition needs to look like in order to get something like that done. I do know that it's a core concern, and everybody thinks there's a political benefit at the end of that rainbow. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So one of the things you didn't have on there as possible agenda items was savings and retirement reform.
Yeah.
So there does seem to be some bipartisanship to get something done. So maybe a comment there.
Yeah.
Also, what's the likelihood that there are too many Dem candidates and they just bash each other, and you get someone that's too far left, and that actually helps Trump?
Yeah. Let me answer that part first. That's the fun part. Yeah, it's a very real possibility. And also, when you look at the unique constituencies in the states that are earliest on the primary calendar, Iowa, New Hampshire, California, like, those are where the most ardent progressive activists, the kind of like Elizabeth Warren types, the resist at all cost types, they are the ones that tend to dominate those constituencies in those states. The only another early one would be Texas, which is a little bit more different. It's a little bit more of a different profile of a Democrat primary voter. So that's one of the very real things, is that they could really go look for the person that is going to be the anti-Trump in a way that maybe goes past the center left, where the big middle of the American electorate that's persuadable in some of these big states that matter for the Electoral College, like Ohio, like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, some of your Rust Belt, blue-collar Democrats. That's a very real possibility, and I expect that that's why, until we see that process play out, his odds will stay around around a pretty good odds until then. So the two, if you look at those same odds makers, and like, take it for what you will, these are more just kind of like, they're fun to look, scroll through your phone on while you're having a couple beers, but it's like, it's got Beto O'Rourke and Kamala Harris, and right now they fit the profile of the most active Democrat, the most active part of the Democrat base love them, but they also have national profiles. So it'll be interesting to see how that all shakes out. Retirement, sorry. The thing that, if you look back at the chaos of 2018, there were things that got done on a bipartisan manner. So the banking bill that got through, right? Trying to think of some of the other areas where there was some progress made, but tax reform got done. That was a little bit more partisan, but the bipartisan big things that got done, most of them were by groups that, first off, really early on in the process, realized that they had to be a resource for the legislative, all the Capitol Hill offices they knew were going to be key to it. And then the second thing they did was they made sure that they didn't boil the ocean. They knew this wasn't one of these big national debates that you had to have. The last thing they wanted anybody to do was have the president tweeting about the bank bill, right? Instead, it was Carper in Delaware, McCaskill in Missouri, things like that. So they really kind of picked and choose how they got to that coalition of votes that they were going to need, and then they just relentlessly hammered away on it. And it was under the radar. It wasn't really, I was actually something I was working on, and the press kind of let us kind of manage this in a really appropriate, substantive way towards passage versus having it become a political football. That is a good template for success for something for like the retirement industry, or like Richie Neal's bill with RISA. That'd be one of the ways to look at how you would advance it. Any other questions? I see a hand back there. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. Am I on good on time? Sorry about that. Yeah. Right on time. Right on time. Right on time. Yep.
You alluded to trade, and I was just wondering if you have a view on what Grassley taking over Senate Finance might mean for sort of a check on Trump's trade impulses.
Well, I hope it means. I don't know yet. He hasn't given much of an indication. He has been very vocal. I think the Senate has been much more vocal on this. Grassley, Johnson, people from ag states where soybeans are piling up, and if you look at the data for some of these House districts, like the first district in Iowa, like people felt worse about the economy with Trump than they did after he was elected because of the trade wars. So that's an important distinction. So I think he will be vocal. I think he will try. I think one of the big focus right now is to get USMCA passed because they really do legitimately worry he will tear up NAFTA and what that could do to markets. So he's going to push. He's going to push forward. The wild card is the House. Can Nancy Pelosi get enough Democrats to vote for a trade bill with Republicans and give the president a political win? That's the thing that I don't feel good about that right now. We'll see. It's going to be difficult. Yeah, and most folks that are pro-trade sort of recognize the challenge, but are embracing it. Yeah. All right.